Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the Performance Measures Web Service. My name is Josh Legler. We also have Karin Jacobson from the NEMSIS TAC on the line. And today we'll be presenting a webinar about a new web service that the NEMSIS Technical Assistance Center has been developing and is ready for some public preview and public feedback from vendors. At the beginning of the call here, we just want to remind everyone to mute your lines if you're not speaking so that it'll be easy to hear the person who is speaking. We are recording this webinar, so others who were not able to join us in real time today have an opportunity to view the webinar later. I think before we jump into the webinar, I just want to get a sense from those on the line. Maybe those of you who were on the V3 vendor call last week, where I gave an introductory presentation about the Performance Measures web service. I'm just curious how many of you were on that call. So maybe now that I've asked you to mute yourselves, you can momentarily unmute yourselves and just kind of give me a shout out if you were on that call last week. Nobody?
Josh, this is Ben. I was on that call.
Okay.
This is Rob, and I was not on the call.
Okay. Okay, so most of you were not on the call last week, it sounds like. So I'll make sure I give a good full demonstration today. What I'd like to do today, as far as the agenda goes, is describe for you the NEMSIS Performance Measures web service that, as I said, is currently in a public preview release stage. We're actively collecting feedback on it. And then I want to also allow time on the call today so that we can begin collecting some feedback from you today. But we will also give you the next few weeks to provide feedback to us. We're asking for feedback to be provided by Friday, July 14th. So a little over 3 weeks away. Okay, so let's start out with a good overview and demonstration of the NEMSIS V3 Performance Measures service. And I should mention this, the target audience for today's call really is software developers, people from the vendor community who would be implementing products that would utilize this service, and then your product would have the UI or the presentation to the end user. So this is not a service that is going to be directly used by end users. It's going to be happening through your products and through the UIs that you provide. Okay, so we're going to start out on the NEMSIS homepage. And in the latest news section, there's an announcement about the Performance Measures API. And that's your starting point. There's a link there to a Performance Measures web service technical guide. And I'd like to start out in that technical guide with some foundational information about this web service. Then we'll move on to a demonstration. So here's the technical guide. And first, let's start with the overview here. As I mentioned, this Performance Measures web service is designed to be used by you, the software developers, in the design of your products. And your products then would provide reports to your customers or your users that would include data that you obtained from the NEMSIS Performance Measure web service. The purpose of the Performance Measure web service is to implement performance measures that have been established through the EMS Compass project. And there is a link to the EMS Compass website where you can get more information about those measures. If you're not familiar with the EMS Compass measures by now, I would highly recommend that you spend some time on that website and get familiar with the work that was done over the past 2 to 3 years on that project. So this national web service is going to implement those EMS Compass measures that can be measured using national NEMSIS version 3 data elements. There are some EMS Compass performance measures that rely on data elements that are either not national elements, so the NEMSIS TAC doesn't have that data, or data from other sources besides NEMSIS. Now, the purpose of this web service then is to provide national level comparative data on how EMS across the nation is doing on these EMS Compass performance measures. So for example, there's a performance measure, trauma-01, which measures whether pain medication was given for a traumatic injury call. And your customers could look at their own data, and you could provide a report to them that would show them how well they're doing at pain management in their trauma calls. That's great. But then
Josh, I'm going to interrupt real quickly. Just so everybody knows, I am going to take administrative control here and mute everyone. So just so you know, if you want to ask a question later, you need to click on *6. So I am muting everyone to unmute yourself, *6.
And you might need to specifically. Oh, I just unmuted everyone, didn't I? So Karen, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Josh.
Okay.
I don't think I think this is only the phone participants, I think, are muted. So if somebody is participating via computer, we will still hear background noise. So if you can mute your speaker side of that. But Josh, I can hear you just fine.
Yeah, okay. I'll try real quick to do the mute everyone again and see if I'm still. Am I still?
Josh, I can hear you, Josh.
Okay, I think we're set. Both of us are on, others are muted, and when we get to a point where we are looking for comments and questions, we'll try to open that up some more. But also
Perfect.
Feel free to put something in the chat or to manually unmute yourself to jump in and interrupt.
Okay, we do see a chat message, so we'll be working with everybody there. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, great. Okay, so so the agency may get a report from your software that tells them how they're doing on that particular performance measure of administering or managing pain in their trauma patients. But they might want to know how they're doing compared to other agencies, all agencies in the nation or other agencies that are like them, you know, other fire departments, other paramedic level agencies, other rural agencies. And all of that data, you don't have that data in your software because you only have data from your own customers. So you can hit the NEMSIS performance measure web service to get that national level comparative data. And then you can include that data or merge it in to a report that you provide to your customers. And now they can see their own data next to national level data. Okay, so this is implemented as a SOAP web service. And the document has the location of the WSDL. And so you can load that WSDL up in your development or testing suite and start playing around with it. I do have an important note here on this page, and we do welcome feedback on this. The web server that this has been set up on only accepts HTTPS connections, so you cannot do an unencrypted HTTP connection. And moreover, it only supports TLS 1.2 for the connection protocol and a very limited set of cipher suites for HTTPS. And so we've seen that there are some popular HTTPS clients that are unable to connect to this server because it is so limited in its HTTPS cipher suite support. We welcome you to test in your own development environment and let us know your results. If you're unable to connect to the server, it's most likely because of this HTTPS problem. In particular, I've mentioned here that Java versions below 1.8 are unable to connect to this server. And why is that important? Well, some of you may be using Java 1.7 or lower in your development environment, but also if you're just going to do some manual testing with a product called SOAP UI, SOAP UI out of the box comes with a bundled version of Java 1.7, and it's unable to connect to this server. So there is a workaround here in the document, and that is that in your SOAP UI installation folder, you'll see a folder called JRE. That is the bundled Java folder. If you delete or rename that folder, then SOAP UI will run using the Java that's installed on your operating system, which is probably a newer version of Java. So that's unfortunate that we've got some limitations here. Again, public preview release, and we really need feedback from vendors to let us know how how bad of an issue this will be going forward so that we can take that message to the server admins about what they may need to change. There's another bug. The WSDL lists a localhost address for the endpoint URL. So you're also going to need to manually update the endpoint URL to this URL listed here. So unfortunately, we do have some limitations that you need to be aware of as you're testing. Okay, the performance measures web service includes 3 operations, and we're going to be looking at each of those 3 operations. The first one lists the benchmarks that the service currently supports. The second one lists all of the parameters that it currently supports, which you can use on the client side to request that the data being returned to you be filtered in certain ways. So for example, I only want urban, or I only want 2016, things like that. And then the main operation available is benchmark retrieval, which provides you the actual benchmark data from the national database. Okay, so we're going to switch over to some demonstration and see how that works. Here I have SOAP UI, where I have done that tweak so that it's using Java 1.8. I have loaded the WSDL from the server and created this project so that we can do a little bit of testing. I have also manually updated the URL that I'm going to be hitting in these requests. I'm going to start with the list benchmarks request. Here's the URL that we're hitting with this request. The request here is very simple. It's basically an empty request that just says, give me a list of all the benchmarks that are supported in this service. And so I'm going to this a little bit bigger. This is the response that we get from the server. And it currently lists just one benchmark, and that's trauma-01. And a moment ago, I think I mistakenly said pain management of injured patients. It's actually pain assessment of injured patients. And it has the comments there from the EMS Compass website about that performance measure. It also tells you that the numerator and denominator for this measure, both of those are going to be integers as defined in the XML standard. Now, you could get additional information about trauma-01 by looking on the EMS Compass website. So I want to show you just so we can make sure we make the connection here between what EMS Compass did and what this web service is doing. So here's the EMS Compass website. I can go to view the measures. I can look for trauma-01. I can click on that measure to get all of the EMS Compass definition and information about this measure. So for you as a vendor at the local level, in your product, you know how to calculate this data for your customers because EMS Compass has provided the pseudocode to use for the numerator and for the denominator, all using NEMSIS elements and NEMSIS codes. So everyone can implement consistently. So there's where all the information is. But in the Performance Measures web service, you'll get some basic information back about which measures are supported. We have started in this public preview release with just trauma-01. That's the only measure currently supported. We have a couple more that we'll be implementing next, and then we'll just work our way down through all of the EMS Compass measures that can be supported using national data. But for now, you'll be testing with just this one measure. Okay, the second request is to list parameters. When you run this request, again, it's just an empty request. The service gives you back a list of the different parameters that you could include in your benchmark retrieval requests. And we are not currently supporting all of the parameters that we intend to support. We are supporting 3 right now, and there will be more coming. We are supporting a parameter around urbanicity, and you'll see that urban has a particular code, suburban has a particular code, and so on. We are also supporting calendar year 2014 through the current year, and calendar month, January through December, with a number for each month. So this tells you what parameters you can use when you submit benchmark requests. Okay, so back in the guide, just want to show you what we will support down the road for parameters. So urbanicity, year, and month are currently supported. And you can see a list here of the other parameters that we intend to support in this service. You'll get things like whether they're a fire department or a hospital-based, what region of the country they're in, what their run volume is like, so we can compare small to small, large to large, and the level of care that they provide. All right, back over to the demonstration. And let's move on to a list benchmarks request, or sorry, a benchmark retrieval request. And let's just start from scratch here. Here's my request. This is a very simple request where I've put in the ID of the benchmark that I'm looking for, trauma-01, and I've provided no parameters or filtering kind of things. I've just said, give me the national numbers for trauma-01. So I'll go ahead and run that, even though it's already up there on the other side. So that took about a half second to run that. And I got a response from the system. I'm going to skip down to the meat of the response, and that's in the benchmark details here. It's telling me that there were 221,000 records that met the denominator criteria for this benchmark. So in other words, 221,000 records where possible injury was marked yes. And then it gives me the numerator and denominator for that measure. In this particular measure, the denominator and the numerator are both just a count of records. So the denominator happens to match the count of records. And the numerator is the number of records on which pain assessment was done. So there was a pain scale recorded. So we see here that out of the 221,000 records, there were about 104,000 records where a pain scale was recorded. So if you were to calculate that, then you'll get, like a 45% or something. And that's for everything in the database. If I bump up to the top here, I get some metadata about the database itself. We learn when the database, when the performance measures database was last updated. It's actually been a few months, but in full production, this will be either probably a weekly refresh. And also how many records are in the database total. So about 1.7 million records currently in the V3 database. So that's a very simple request. Give me trauma-01 and I just get a numerator and a denominator for the whole database. We're going to move on to a couple additional requests to see how you can parameterize this. Request number 2, I'm going to ask for the trauma-01 benchmark. That's great. But I'm going to add some filters, and you'll see I'm adding 2 filters here, one on calendar year and another on calendar month. In a future release, we will probably change this to a hierarchical approach. So you would be saying December 2016 rather than a combination of 2 independent parameters. But for now, it's implemented this way. So for calendar year, how do I know what ID to use for a filter? Well, that came from my my list parameters response, where I saw that this one is called par calendar year. That's the ID. And then the different years are simply numbers as we would expect. So I put in 2016 for my code. So I'm going to filter this request down to just the records where the unit notified date time was in 2016. I have a second filter here, filtering to the month of December. So all in all, this is going to filter me down to only the records from December 2016. So we're going to go ahead and run that request. Again, took about half a second to get a response here. It echoes back the filters that I had submitted. It still gives me the metadata about the database. stays the same. And then in the details, I see different numbers. So since we're looking at only December 2016, we're seeing a much smaller number of records that contributed to this measure, a little under 17,000. The denominator for this particular measure is the same as the count of records, and then the numerator 7569. So we're still again looking, even when we zoom down to this 1 month, we're seeing a percentage that's maybe around 45% or so. So that's a request where I filtered down to a particular month and year. I'm going to bring up a third request now. And in this one, I've got my year and my month, but I'm adding one more filter on urbanicity. So I got that ID from the list parameters response, and I got the code to use also from that response. And I can go ahead and submit this request. And what you're going to notice is that this request does not respond in half a second. And that's because for the previous two requests, we were making requests for which the service has already pre-aggregated the data. It's pre-compiled those common high-level combinations of requests. But if you put in a filter combination that's more detailed, then it's going to go to the actual underlying data and run the numbers. And so this request is actually going to take 30 seconds to a minute probably for this one to respond. When it does respond, we will see an even smaller number. Yeah, so about 12,000. Remember, for December 2016, we had about 17,000. When we limit it down to urban agencies only, then we're down to about 12,000 records that are included in the results. And then we see the number that had a pain scale recorded, 5705. So we're still seeing somewhere in the 40s as far as a percentage. Okay, so we anticipate or would recommend that you would retrieve these benchmarks and cache them on your end, and then periodically refresh your cache. But we would appreciate feedback from you, and I'll open it up for feedback in a moment today, but also over the next few weeks. We would welcome feedback from you regarding how you would implement and what would be helpful on our end, or things that we might need to change to make it easier for you to implement and easier to support. Okay, so this ran through the three types of requests or operations. The really simple ones to just simply list out the benchmarks that are currently supported, list out parameters that are currently supported, and then we ran through several examples of retrieving benchmark data. Before we open it up for feedback, I do want to briefly describe what's coming in future releases of this product. Number one, we're going to support more benchmarks. So it won't be just the trauma-01 benchmark, there will be more. Number two, we will support more parameters, and I showed you the list of parameters that we intend to support. Number three, we will support the ability to request segmented data so that you'll get a whole bunch of results in one response. So for example, let's say we were looking at this request here where we looked for December 2016. Well, let's say, for example, that you want to request the data for each month of 2016 so that you can draw a line chart for your user. Well, currently, you could submit the data you could request the data for 2016 as a whole. You could also request data for each month of 2016, and that's going to be as a separate request. So you'll need to submit 12 requests to get each of the 12 months in 2016, because you'll get just one set of numbers back. In a future release, we will allow you to put in a request that says, give me all of the children of 2016. And in the response, then, we would have multiple sets of benchmark details, one set for each month of 2016. Or give me all of the children of urbanicity. And then you would get results back that would give you the number for urban, suburban, rural, etc. So that's coming in the future. And lastly, we are going to support additional metadata. Currently, you just see when the database was last updated and how many records are in the overall database and how many records contributed to your benchmark request. But in the future, let me see if I can get to the metadata page. In addition to those things, we will also support a couple additional pieces of metadata that are not in bold here yet. One is the count of the states and territories whose records contributed to the results. So, there were 13 or there were 19 states represented in this result. And second, the number of EMS agencies represented in the results. So, there were 3,000 EMS agencies represented in this result. So that'll just give you some additional foundational information about the statistical strength of these measures. Okay. Lastly, I want to come back to the end user, your customers who are using your product, and how this may end up being seen by them after the work that you do. Okay, so here's an example of what your customer might see or what you might develop for your customer. So you might have a reporting feature within your product that generates a line chart. And you've implemented the Trauma-01 EMS Compass performance measure. You got all the information about how to technically implement that by visiting the EMS Compass website. And that's great. You're able to show your customer a trend line for how they're doing at assessing pain in injured patients. But maybe your customer also wants to know how they compare to others. And that's where the performance measure web service comes in. So this red line represents data that you have in your own system for your customer. And this blue line represents national data that you would have obtained through the performance measures web service provided by the NEMSIS TAC. And so you can draw a second line on these charts for your customers to say, this is what the national level looks like. Or maybe your customer says, well, I want to compare myself nationally to all other paramedic agencies. So you could grab that data from the web service. Of course, currently we don't support service level, but in a future release we will. Currently we support urbanicity. So your customer could say, I want to compare myself to the rest of the country, but I am a rural agency, and I really want to know how I'm doing compared to other rural agencies. So you could request the data from the national service for rural agencies only and draw that national trend line for your customer. I apologize for my voice. I've been on a ton of webinars this week. Okay, so at this point, that runs through the information that I wanted to present to you, and I want to open things up so that we can get questions and also feedback from you. Some of you may have actually had a chance to start dabbling around in this already and may have some feedback already.
Talk now.
Or you may have questions. Hold on. Okay, I guess I unmuted everyone a little too early, perhaps. All right, sounds like we've settled down. So, hold on. Okay, sorry about the difficulties with the audio. I think you're going to need to manually unmute yourself because it sounds like we get a ton of feedback if we unmute everyone. Is that going to work?
Yeah, so if you want to speak, what you'll do is hit *6 on your phones if you have questions. Clay, can you try that first and make sure it's working? *6.
Well, it might not be working for Clay. We are starting to get questions through the chat that we'll be able to take a look at. Just want to make sure that people have the ability to get on audio as well. Another way we can go is I believe that I can unmute you if you request through the chat to be unmuted, so that could work too. Okay.
So, Josh, the first question?
Yeah, let's jump into that one.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so from Chad, he asked, is there a state parameter? And the answer is no, there is not currently a state parameter because currently the NEMSIS TAC does not have the permission necessary to identify states in the data that they release publicly. However, conversations have been ongoing about getting permission from the states to allow that identification to be released. Now, Clay, I don't know if you were successfully able to unmute, but I wonder if you might be able to speak to the progress of that discussion. Karin, do you happen to know where that discussion is currently? Did we lose Karin too on the audio?
Hi, Josh. No. I've just brought Clay in my office, so I apologize that he wasn't on the line. So will you rephrase the question?
Yeah, I know that there's currently an effort underway or some discussions to allow states to be identified in the data that NEMSIS releases publicly. And so currently the performance measures web service does not support querying the data down to a state level because NEMSIS is currently not allowed to release that level of detail. But I know it's being talked about, so I was wondering if there's an update on that conversation and how that's going.
Great question. I'm not sure that much progress has been made. We recently returned from a meeting with NITS in Washington, D.C., where the topic was brought up again. I know that they'd like to forward the initial work done by NEMSIS last year to allow that to become an additional element that could be released for research, but there's much work to be done there. I guess the other approach to this, and maybe this isn't the best audience to talk about it, but I also was at least contemplating the idea that we could use authentication in the API web service to distinguish different states requesting data. Has that not been an idea that we've thrown around, Josh?
We have not. Currently, the web service is publicly available and requires no authentication. What you're talking about might be, so for example, a state is a customer of a particular vendor product, and something where we would allow that vendor product to make queries to this web service, but with some credentials that represent that state customer, and that if they did that, they'd be able to get data back regarding the state. We'd have to, I guess, for further discussion on that, we'd have to look at how that would work at the local level, say a product being used at a local agency level that is not the same product that the state uses for data collection. Would there be a way of a state authorizing that product to get their state level data, and how would they contain that across the different states that vendor serves? So that'd be some considerations we'd have to discuss.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've had some preliminary discussions here, but only about the idea. So I think the idea of having state-specific information included in this development is probably down the road a bit.
Okay. All right. So other questions or feedback, you can either just send a chat message or unmute yourself or ask us to unmute you. Okay, maybe I'll turn it around and start asking questions of my own. This, as we've mentioned, is a public preview release. The API is subject to change, so we do not recommend that you would just go ahead and implement this into your production product today. Instead, we're asking that you test it and evaluate it, and that we will come out with a new release. We're probably looking around the end of this year for that new release. To have all of the full capabilities and to have your feedback incorporated into it. And then at that point, you'd have a stable API and you could start developing at your level. But with that timeline in mind, I'll just ask the question and then I'll get back to the chat. There's another question there, but let me just ask all of you who represent vendors, do you see that this would be doable for you to implement this connection to a national web service and to incorporate that national data into the reporting features in your product? What's it looking like for you as you look at your products? Quiet. I hope everyone's not having too much difficulty with how to unmute. What was the command again, Karin, to unmute if you're on the phone?
It is *6, and just so you know, the pounding noise is actually coming from NEMSIS. It turns out they're doing some construction like two or three walls over, but it's here locally. So, Josh, why don't you try it once again? Right now it's quiet.
Okay, we'll push the button and see what happens.
Talk now.
Or not. Sorry that you have to mute everybody again, Josh.
Okay, you know what? I think I found it was Bernie's connection when we unmuted everyone. So Bernie, you are muted. Everyone else is still as they were. Okay, that seems pretty quiet. We're good. Maybe some of you can try talking. We'll see if it's working.
Thanks, Josh.
So again, the question is, can you see your company being able to implement this sort of a scenario into your reporting features? Super quiet. Do we need to call out some individual vendors or?
I'm known for that. Everybody knows that I'm known for that. So you might want to offer something up, everybody.
Josh, this is Ben from Zoll, and I think, oh wait, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
We can.
Oh, okay. I think there's interest, just, right now at this exact time, I don't think it's something that we'd be getting to right away, but it's certainly interest from us.
Okay, yeah, where you'll be watching our progress and when we get
started. Yeah, there's certainly, we'll absolutely be staying tuned on the progress and seeing how this unfolds. I think EMS Compass as a whole has a lot that it's kind of still going through, and so I think we'll be certainly being staying in tune with everything that's happening.
Yeah, great, thanks for that info.
Josh, this is Clay. Ben, maybe one more question to you. I apologize. Are you including local performance measures now in your product as a mechanism whereby there's some reporting that can be done, like at the local level for folks to look at?
Yes. Yeah, we provide that today.
And in your kind of assessment of that, is it wildly different from what's in EMS Compass?
It's similar but different. So I'd say there's similarities certainly, but there's also definitely differences. I think more similarities than I would say differences, but they're tough question to, I guess, answer because it goes both ways, I think.
Right. I think that's valuable, and it may be interesting for us at NEMSIS just to take a little step back and ensure that if we're that the way that the EMS Compass measures are being implemented and the data that we're providing back to you isn't just becoming kind of idiosyncratic. Like if it's really just slightly different or different enough from what your customers are now receiving, it may be difficult to interpret. So maybe we should pull some vendors, and I'm sure that many are providing performance measures. It might be valuable to determine just how different those measures are, and whether really there is this idea that we'll all be able to get on to the same bandwagon, with EMS Compass.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're all kind of paying attention to EMS Compass and seeing what's happening. Because I mean, even if you look at the performance measure that's up right there, it's very high level, very, very high level that we're looking at right there. And so I think everyone's just kind of paying attention to it, but I think a lot of us do things that are different from this, and that's where there's the differences are between what they're working on and the things that a lot of us may provide for our customers.
So you may provide some reports that are more detailed or that drill a little further down, so the agency can identify perhaps causes when they're trying to implement changes. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that would be more accurate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good comment, Ben. So maybe, as I kind of think through this, perhaps that's just what this will provide, right? Maybe it's one thing for an agency to be able to look for variability in, for example, their how often they provide pain assessments, right? We want to ensure that they're done, but say they're hovering around 60% here, like we see on the screen. But when so that's hard. That's hard for an individual agent. They can watch variability there, but it's incredibly hard for them to determine, well, is 60% good or is 60% bad, right? I mean, we'd all like it to be 100%, but maybe the denominator that's associated with the measure just wouldn't really speak to the fact that 100% of people should get pain assessment. So in that kind of situation, an agency may not know, is 60 good or is 60 bad. Well, when they get a chart like this one, the one that we're seeing now, well, they're doing very, very well, right? If the national average is 40%, they're doing something right. If the blue line was up near 90%, then even though they're hovering around 60, well, maybe they're not doing something right. So there might be real value in having the individual type of reporting that's available at the agency level now, but still, how do you benchmark yourself other than just natural variability that occurs over time? So maybe the high level is a value. Does that make sense, Ben? And that it provides, a measure of where they are compared to similar type agencies across the country. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think there's just still a lot of work that the Compass is doing that hasn't been fully vetted out yet. I mean, there's 14 performance measures that are out there, and I think, I don't think that everyone's fully clear of where the direction of where it's headed still. I mean, I'm sure they're looking to do more, but last that at least I had heard, they were still trying to figure out what that looked like. And so I agree that there's certainly value in the high-level overview of what we're seeing here, but I also wonder what additional work are they looking to do with this as well, because I don't know if it'll always stay high level for them, I guess is my point.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, that is. One of the things we see as we look at the EMS Compass performance measure definitions is that clearly over time there's going to need to be some tweaking to those definitions, and there's not a process yet in place to manage those changes at a national level. This might be one example, pain assessment of injured patients. The criteria for the denominator is simply that there was possible injury on the call. Well, down the road, we might want to refine that denominator a little more and say, well, possible injury and the patient was treated, or you know, a particular disposition that we're looking for as well. Because, you know, I mean, you could have been dispatched to a traffic crash, so there was a possible injury, but you got canceled before you got to the scene. And that certainly, we wouldn't expect a pain scale on a canceled call. I think we're going to find some things like that over time, and we don't have a process yet in the EMS Compass area to refine those measures. Okay, there was a question from Joe Williams. What is the refresh rate for the benchmark data? Currently, it's being manually refreshed, and it was last refreshed back in the middle of March. So it's been a while for this public preview release. In full production, it will be released. The data will be refreshed regularly on a schedule, and I'm anticipating that that'll probably be a weekly refresh. We have talked about going as slow as monthly, based on the idea that when you get up to millions of records at the national level, you probably don't see a lot of variability from week to week. But those are the two rates that we have considered, weekly or monthly. We still have time for other questions or additional feedback, especially anyone who may have been playing around with it already. Okay, well, it's been quiet. On the vendor call last week, we had a few comments that came in. One was whether or not we would issue API keys. So we wouldn't require authentication, but by having an API key, it would allow us to better track the usage of the service. So that's something we may consider for the full public release. Someone asked about monitoring the web traffic on this service to see which measures are being used the most. That's certainly something we can do behind the scenes. And questions came up about how the service would handle missing data. This would be a prime example. Let's say that you know, there were a certain number of calls where possible injury was not recorded. So it wasn't a yes, but we don't really know that it was a no. And the guidance we've received through the EMS Compass project has been that you develop an additional measure to measure data completeness. So you would have an additional measure that would measure how often people are filling out the possible injury data elements, and you track that separately. But the EMS Compass measure set currently does not have any of those data quality type measures as part of the family of measures. So that's something that, you know, as NHTSA figures out how to keep EMS Compass going in the future, that would be another area of maintenance to look at. Okay, I'll just reiterate, we are collecting feedback through Friday, July 14th. Just FYI, I personally will be on vacation next week and the following week. You're welcome to submit feedback. You can submit it to Clay or Karin or myself or all three. And if I receive feedback from you the next couple of weeks, you won't hear from me until I get back on July 9th, and then I'll be sure to get back to you to acknowledge your feedback. Okay, so by July 14th, that's when we'd like the feedback. Feel free to fire up a SOAP testing tool or to do some work in your own development environment to just play around with it, hit the web service, and collect your thoughts about what we should change as we go forward to a full public release.
So Josh, let me ask two questions just to reiterate. So where can people find the web service URL?
Yeah, so they will come, let me get some stuff out of the way from Join Me. They will come to the NEMSIS homepage, grab the technical guide, and within that technical guide, they will find the link to the WSDL on page 2. But as I mentioned, currently, when they grab that WSDL, they're going to see a localhost address. Here's the WSDL. And down at the bottom, oh, it looks like, yay, like that's been fixed in the last week or two. Great. So if you're lucky, you'll just load up the WSDL. Looks like that is resolved.
Fantastic. And how about credentials? Are credentials needed to access this resource?
No credentials needed. So pull down the WSDL and start hitting it with test requests.
Fantastic. I think maybe what we will do is send out another email that references how to access the system and that credentials are not required, so that everyone clearly understands that, and that and the date that we would like to receive feedback.
Yeah, great.
All right, last opportunity for questions before we shut the webinar down today. We really appreciate so many of you joining. It was nice to see some of the folks that have participated today have been those beyond the software development community. So thanks again for participating. Be well, have a great week. You know how to reach us. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.